Hi everybody, welcome to my channel or welcome back. My name is Saf and today we are doing a drawing process video. So first and foremost, as you can see, when I start out drawing, I always start out drawing rough placements of where I want my sketch to be. Particularly for this one, I was doing a draw this in your style. You can take a look at the artist here. And so I opened up a reference, which you can do in Procreate, and see a reference of an original image, which helped a lot because essentially the whole point of draw this in your style challenges is literally recreating something that someone else made in your own style. So having the reference there was really helpful for me in actually getting my placements together and planning out how I wanted my own composition to actually look. Something to note here that this initial process is very messy for me, and as you can see, I'm not really worried about how it looks. I'm mostly just worried about the composition and where I'm gonna place certain elements. As you can see, I'm rushing the hand here and it looks terrible, but I'm gonna fix that later on, and I really just wanna see how my entire piece is gonna come together in the end, so I'm just drawing rough spaces. Next, we're moving on to the sketch. So I like to lower the opacity of the placement layer, and on top of that create a new layer and use a different color. So I'm literally using the same sketch pencil that I was just using. All I did was change the color to red, and now I'm essentially outlining the initial layer, and this time I'm making sure that my lines are clean. And for me in my process, this is probably the most important step because when I place the color, I'm literally tracing over this sketch. So I want my sketch to be as clean, as neat as possible. And so that's why you see me here literally erasing the hairlines and starting over so many times, because this is like the base and the skeleton for me of what my drawing is gonna look like at the end. So I'm literally taking my time with the hands and just wanting to make it perfect. And I don't know about you guys, but hands are probably one of the hardest things to draw for me. So this time lapse or screen recording of my drawing is like sped up, but it's still taking really long to draw because I don't know if anybody else can relate, but hands are just really difficult. I hope I'm not the only one who thinks that way. So now when it's time for me to create my facial expressions, I create another new layer on top of this initial sketch layer just because I want to later on erase that cross. And what that cross is, it helps me figure out how I want my expression to look and where I want the eyes to be. So it's kind of like the line where the eyes and the nose go, it's placed in a certain position so that the girl is going to be looking off to the side a bit, and that's why I have that cross. And creating the new layer essentially helps me see that cross but also create my eye and facial expressions in a clean way. Creating the lips is probably one of my most favorite parts. I always start off with 3 little circles, 2 at the top for kind of like that Cupid's bow, and 1 in the middle of them for that little droop that you see in the lips. I love this. I always love to make my lips nice and full and juicy on all of the women that I create, and these little circle method is what helps me get them to look that way. As you can see here, now I'm erasing that cross that I mentioned before so that I could get a better look of the facial expression. And as you can see here, the eye on the left side is a little lopsided. So now that I've erased the cross, I can easily select it and move it up so that it looks proper, just as I've done here. So now I'm just adding in details such as the fingernails and all of the accessories as well as the flower placements, just so I can finish up my sketch and move on to the color process. Something that I wanted to mention is, like I said, I'm very precise with how I'm drawing my sketches, but what I failed to mention was that I really only do that for portraits. When I'm drawing in the little details like the flowers and the leaves, as you can see here, I'm a little bit more rough just because these aren't people and they don't have to be so precise, and I actually like how it looks when it is a little bit wavy and mismatchy and not so perfect. And so I literally am just doing a cleaner version of what I want the flowers to look like, but when I actually go in and add the color, you'll see me clean it up a bit more but also allow for that imperfectness. On to the next step, flat color. So the first thing I do in this step is actually create my background color. I feel like the rest of the colors that I choose for the illustration really depend on what the background color is. So I always make sure to do this first. And the next step I do is find the perfect skin color that I want for the illustration. Depending on the background color, I'll have to play around with different tones, but I always love to draw brown girls or women of color in my artwork. As you can see, I am just starting out by outlining the girl's hands and face, and you can't see too much of her skin because her whole body is covered by hair here, but it's just important for me to get that outline in. And as you can see, I changed the tone a bit because I felt like against this specific pink, the original tone was a bit too dull, so I essentially just upped the saturation. Now I'm going in and outlining the white hair. Sometimes it's a little tricky with layering and hair and finding the right layers, so for this one specifically, I believe I put the hair layer behind the skin layer, which meant I had to essentially trace the outline of the hands and the skin so that it could show, so that each layer could show, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making sense, guys, but you're watching the video, so you can pause and see exactly what I'm doing realistically. So when I'm drawing the flowers, I don't know why I'm using the same pencil here, but you'll see in a second, I change it into a syrup pen right here, and you can see the lines look way better, and they're a little bit more free-flowing and raw and authentic, which is what I like to use in my flowers and leaves. Now, as you see I'm drawing the flowers, you're probably wondering, how are the flowers staying inside the hair? Well, in case you missed it, I made a clipping mask. So above the hair layer, I clipped the flower mask to the hair, so that way the flowers would actually just stay inside of the hair, kind of like details of the hair as part of the hair, like the hair and the flowers are one. So that's why it kind of gets cut off at the end of the hair, and it only goes, the flowers only show where the hair is. I started out by using this purpley color for the stars and circles, but once I filled them in, I did not like them at all. I felt it was too stand out-y. It stood out way too much. So I ended up playing around with it, which you'll see here in just a second, and I just ended up making them pink. I felt like the pink blended in more with the rest of the flowers inside of the hair. When I am creating the center of the flowers and any flower illustrations that I do, I always pick the color of the leaves and go a shade or two darker than what the leaves are, and that's how I make the center of the shade so that they're still the same tone of the petals, but just a little bit darker. Now I'm just literally cleaning up the little details here around the hair, making sure that everything looks smooth, and adding in the base coloring. So I like to always match my eyebrows to my hair, and again, I'm using the syrup pen here for those details. And when I'm drawing the shading of the face, I again take the color of the skin and I just make it a shade or two darker. So I'm using that for the nose, the ears, all of the little details that you see on the skin, especially the lines in between the hands, and that's what makes it how it is. And here again, I'm using that same syrup brush to add the details into the hair. This is my favorite part about drawing hair, is adding in those details. I feel like it makes the hair feel more flowy, it's not as stiff, and it just gives it a little bit of extra life, like adding that texture. All right, time for the next step, the details. This is one of my favorite parts because I feel like this step is when the illustration actually starts to come together, is when I start adding in these details. So first off, I start with the lips. As I said before, I love drawing lips. I always like to draw a little bit of a highlight on the lips as gloss, and then a little bit of a darker color in the middle as like a line. Like when your lips are together, you kind of always have a little bit of a shadow between the two. So that's what that dark line over there is. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm using that same shadow skin color, I guess you could call it, that I used under the chin and for the nose to draw in the lines between the hands. Next, it's time for the jewelry, and because I like to draw a lot of brown girls in my art, and a lot of my art is inspired by my Indian culture, gold jewelry is something that is so prominent in my heritage, so I like to draw and add certain elements of gold. For this one specifically, I have thin gold bangles, some rings, and later on you'll see I added a hoop as well, and I think I added a nose chain, but I can't remember. You'll see if I did or if I didn't end up adding a nose chain. And then I'm literally adding the details in the leaves, and again, I just go ahead and take a shade darker and add in kind of like a shadow underneath some of the leaves, as well as a little line in the middle to just kind of like as if the leaf was folding in. I like to keep these pretty simple because the main thing of the illustration is the person and not necessarily the leaves, and so I like to keep them simple and just have them be like a little background detail. Now it's time for the shadows. I always like to add shadows where I can. So here I'm adding like a little bit of a darker like white gray color where the hand is underneath the bangles, kind of like showing a bit of a shadow from the hand onto the hair. I don't always do shadows, but I do think that when I add them, it adds like that subtle pop to the illustration and gives it, you know, makes it feel more realistic and pretty. And now of course I have to draw my nails. I love long nails in real life, so I always make sure that my girls have long nails as well. And here I'm also adding in a little bit of highlights to the flowers just to give them, again, a bit of a pop so they're not as flat. And I just think it looks cute realistically. Okay, one of the last steps is the overlays. So when I'm creating my illustrations, they honestly don't feel complete unless I add some kind of overlay to them. I specifically like to add a paper texture and a diagonal canvas texture, and then I go into the blending modes and I add a soft light to them so they aren't as harsh, and I lower the opacity. And honestly, I just use a black color for this, but because of the blending mode, it's able to make it not as harsh. And I don't know, to me, the illustration doesn't feel complete without adding this. It just adds more depth, dimension, and I don't know, I love it. I just feel like it's become my signature style in my illustrations. And I know we already talked about the overlays, but in this illustration specifically, after I added the overlays, it felt a bit empty. And so I went in and added these dots all around the illustration as swirls, something that I do in a lot of my work. And I added some cloud stamps that I had because I think this, again, adds some depth and makes it feel like it's outdoorsy. I opted for a lighter pink color instead of the white to, again, make it look subtle in the background. Here we are with the final time lapse and reveal. As much as portrait illustrations are about the portrait itself, I think adding these little details make the illustration what it is and contribute to your signature style as an artist. The way I shaded, how I added in my details, you know, the overlays, all of those things are what makes your signature style your style. So something that I want to say is it's important to experiment with different techniques, different styles, and find out what essentially works for you. I hope you were able to learn something from my personal drawing process, and remember, this took me years and years of trial and error to develop and get to where I am. And even though I have gotten to a place where I'm happy with my art, I'm constantly learning and experimenting and getting better. So in saying that, I really want to encourage you to try new things and experiment with your style and just see where that takes you, because you literally never know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.